I seriously hope that you're not secretly plotting an intervention to curb my video making spree, because honestly, I just couldn't resist. You guys have been absolute legends with your feedback, and I'm beyond grateful. I really am. So with a little extra time on my hands these past few days, I did what any storytelling addict would do. I made another video. Okay, but this one's a little different. It's a story about a friend of mine named Elliot. A story that I think in some way it's going to echo something really deep inside you. So hang on with this one, okay? Because I think you're going to want to hear this one. All right, Elliot Parker. Okay, he was a man who lived behind this. So I'm going to hold this camera up a lot during this video because this is what I'm talking about. I mean, I really looked up to him. He had mastered the technical aspects already at this point of his craft, the lighting, the composition, the exposure, all calculated with precision. He was incredible. His portfolio was ridiculous. This dramatic portraits, moody landscapes, and images that exuded control and perfection. That's what I could see when I looked at his portfolio. But in our coffee time together every week, he would often share with me, Carlos, there's something missing in my work, something that I can't really quite name. His photos were amazing. They were actually great, but they lacked something. They didn't quite breathe. They didn't play. And he often found himself envious of younger, of course, more experimental photographers. You know, the ones who shot with wild angles. You know, they use bold colors. They capture movement. They capture chaos with an unhinged joy that he could never actually bring himself to embrace. They weren't afraid to take risks, he would say. They weren't afraid to look foolish either. Elliot, on the other hand, was really careful. In fact, he was too careful. And it wasn't until a chance encounter, this is so interesting because this is usually where it goes back to, with an old box of childhood photos at his parents' house, that something clicked. So he's rummaging through this dusty album. He found a picture of himself at 6 years old, dressed in a Batman cape and a mismatched pair of socks, standing triumphantly on his bed, arms raised as if he had just saved Gotham, which he did. The sheer joy on his face was almost unrecognizable. And then he remembered, that's enough, Elliot. Calm down. Why are you always so much? His father had sighed, rubbing his templates as Elliot bounced around the room, making sound effects, laughing. And just like that, the moment had ended. He had sat down, quiet, and learning that his exuberance was a nuisance. As Elliot held that photograph in his hands, a strange realization settled in his chest. He had spent his entire life being careful, not just in his behavior, but in his art. For years, Elliot had chosen safety over expression. He never experimented with chaotic motion in his photos because he feared losing control of the frame. He stuck to classic, clean edits because he didn't want to create something too loud or too much. He avoided street photography at all costs because candid, unpredictable moments felt extremely messy, too messy. Even when working with models, he gave these rigid, structured instructions to them, never allowing room for spontaneity or play. His work was technically perfect, but emotionally hollow, just like his childhood, where he learned to suppress his bigness, his wildness, his joy. So one day, Elliot was hired to shoot a children's festival at this local park, a gig that he normally wouldn't take, but he needed the money, like many of us do. The day was filled with laughter. It was filled with movement, unfiltered playfulness. But as he moved through the event, snapping images, he realized something. He wasn't just capturing joy. He was documenting it from a safe distance. And he watched this little girl. I remember him telling me, Carlos, I watched this little girl twirling in this little bright yellow dress. Her arms were flung wide, utterly lost in the moment. Elliot raised his camera, but he hesitated. What if I didn't just capture the moment? What if I stepped into it? And for the first time in years, he let go. He adjusted his shutter speed to capture the blur of the moment. He experimented with angles that he had once deemed unprofessional. He laughed. He ran alongside the children, shot from the ground, from the sky, from every place that his old self would have avoided. By the end of the day, he was exhausted. But when he reviewed the images later that night, something stirred inside of him. They weren't perfect. Of course they weren't. They weren't even technically flawless like he was used to. But for the first time, his work felt alive. That day was a turning point for Elliot. He didn't change overnight, but Elliot began to push against the lie that he had believed for so long. He shot in ways that felt fun rather than just looked right. He let go of control, embracing the beautiful chaos of spontaneity. He stopped fearing that his creativity was too much, and he started leaning into the freedom of being fully alive in his craft. Months later, this is so interesting, months later in an art gallery displaying all of his latest work, this older gal stepped in and she stopped in front of one of his photos. This really vibrant, motion-filled shot of a child, mid-laugh, wind in her hair, caught in a moment of pure joy. This one feels free. Elliot connected with something, and he smiled back at her, and he exhaled deeply because he had this deep connection. For the first time in a long time, he knew he was too. And so are you. Now go. Play, create, capture, and be too much.